In 1937, the most photographed kept woman in America sat down and wrote a check for $1 million, sold her jewels when that was not enough, and quietly saved the richest publisher in the country from ruin. Her name was Marion Davies. 4 years later, a single film taught the whole country that she was a talentless fool, and she was not the only one. There was the mistress who shaped a railroad baron's fortune and then erased her own birth to keep it. The healer whose hands revived the richest man in New York until his family bought her a ticket out of the country. The girl in the mansion the newspapers called the House of Mystery, carried out piece by piece and sold to strangers. And the beauty 2 men destroyed each other over, buried in Paris with 3 mourners at her grave. 5 women who reached the center of American power and were made to disappear from the record of it. The only question left is who did the erasing and whose hands were really on the money. Before we begin, if you love the women the history books shrank down to a footnote, subscribe and stay close, because here I give them back the full evening they were denied. There are 5 of them tonight, and each one earned it. Chapter 1. The law freed her, and the world still asked for a man. By the 1860s, a married woman in New York could own property on paper, and almost nobody with money behaved as though she could. The statute books had changed. The habits of the men who ran the banks, the boards, the courtrooms, and the auction houses had not. New York had passed a Married Women's Property Act in 1848 and widened it in 1860, and on the page, a wife could at last hold what was hers, keep her own wages, inherit in her own name. In the marble rooms where the money actually moved, a clerk still looked past the woman at the counter and waited for the husband, the father, the brother, the trustee, the man whose signature made a thing real. The law had opened a door. The world went on holding it shut, with one shoulder against it, smiling. This is a story about 5 women who got a hand, or sometimes 2, through that door anyway. They reached the men at the very center of American wealth and American power, the railroad kings and the publishers and the financiers whose names are still carved over the entrances of museums and libraries. They did not reach them as wives. They reached them as mistresses, companions, healers. The woman kept a few streets from the marital home, the woman a family paid to vanish. And in each case the reward for touching that much power was the same. When the affair turned inconvenient, she was erased, not merely dropped, written out, cut from the will, bought a passage abroad, sold at auction, painted over, buried without a name the world would say aloud. The power was real. The record of it was rewritten so that no one would remember whose hands were on it. To understand how completely a woman could vanish, you first have to see the machine that ran her world, because the machine is the same in all 5 lives. Its first gear was the law, and the long afterlife of a thing called coverture, the old doctrine that a wife's legal person was folded into her husband's, so that in the eyes of the courts, the 2 were one, and the one was him. The property acts chipped at coverture. They did not kill the reflex behind it. A woman with a fortune of her own still found that the world expected a man to stand between her and it, and when no husband existed, the fortune itself could feel like something borrowed, something that might be called back. The second gear was society, and society in Gilded Age New York had a gatekeeper, the woman the columns wrote of simply as the Mrs. Astor, as though there could only be one. The circle she presided over had a famous name, the 400, supposedly the count of the people who truly mattered. What matters for our 5 women is the shape of the gate, not the arithmetic. A wife might spend a lifetime and a fortune trying to be received inside it. A mistress was outside it by definition, and everyone understood that a man could keep a woman in emeralds and still be forbidden to be seen with her at Delmonico's. The wealth was private. The disgrace was public. That gap between the gilded surface and the ruin underneath is the engine of every story here. And the gap did something strange to these particular women, because it made them at once the most visible and the most erasable people in the country. A mistress of a great man was watched constantly, gossiped about, followed by the eyes of a whole city that knew exactly who she was and pretended not to. Her clothes were noted, her jewels priced, her comings and goings tracked from behind curtains. She was, in the fullest sense, a public figure, and yet none of that visibility was hers to keep or to use. It was borrowed, like everything else, from the man, and the same city that studied her every move could be made to forget her overnight the moment he withdrew his protection, because she had no independent standing to hold her in place, no office, no title the world would honor, no vote, no legal person the courts would fully recognize. She was famous entirely at another's pleasure. That is the peculiar cruelty at the heart of all 5 lives, to be watched by everyone and owned, in the end, by no one but the man, so that when he was gone, the watching simply stopped, and the woman who had been the most looked at figure in a room became, in a season, a woman no one could quite recall. The third gear was the press, and the press could be a weapon in either direction. A newspaper could make a woman famous overnight, and a scandal sheet could unmake her just as fast. There was the daily press, the Herald and its rivals, hungry for a rich man's secret. There was the society gossip weekly, Town Topics, which traded in the private lives of the wealthy and would sell a family its silence. There was even a vanity book called Fads and Fancies, which invited the very rich to pay to be flattered, and which one of our women paid, and paid again, to keep her past out of. The record these papers kept was the record that survived. When they chose to publish a woman, or to bury her, they were deciding what history would remember. There was a fourth gear, quieter than the others and more frightening, and it is the one modern viewers forget. A woman who became inconvenient could, in the world of these 5, simply be made to disappear into a private institution. The century had built a whole apparatus of asylums and commitment, and the door to it did not always require much more than a doctor's signature and a family's wish. A daughter who would not marry the right man, a wife who embarrassed a fortune, a mistress who knew too much, could find herself declared unwell and shut away under a false name, and the record would show only that she had gone quietly to rest her nerves. That threat sat under every one of these lives like a trap door. It did not have to be used often. It only had to be possible, and everyone understood that it was. And understand how total a mistress's dependence really was, because it is the thing the emeralds and the mansions are designed to hide. She held nothing in her own right unless she was clever enough to seize it. The house was in his name. The staff were paid by his office. The jewels could be reclaimed. The friends were his friends. The invitations his to grant or cancel. The very rooms she lived in his to empty. When the man died or tired or was talked round by a wife, a woman could lose in an afternoon everything a decade had built, and she had no court that would hear her and no vote that would defend her. The gilded life of the kept woman was a life lived entirely on someone else's signature, and the signature could be withdrawn. And the last thing to hold in mind, under all of it, is the simplest. Not one of the 5 women in this film could vote. They could shape a railroad, bankroll a Wall Street firm, direct the taste behind the greatest art collection in America, hold a titan's whole heart in a trunk of letters, and they could not cast a ballot in the country whose fortunes they were quietly steering. their power was real, and it ran entirely through men, and it could end the instant a man decided it should. Keep that in your mind as the faces go by, because the same question follows each of them from the parlor to the grave. When the money moved, and the empire rose, and the collection was bought, and the will was written, whose hands were really on it? We begin with the one who understood the machine better than any of them, because she survived it. She did the thing the era did to the other four, and she did it first, and she did it to herself. Chapter 2. A boarding house girl studies how to disappear. No birth certificate for her has ever been found, which is the first thing she arranged and the last thing anyone could prove. She was born Arabella Duval Yarrington, most likely in Richmond, Virginia, in 1850 or 1851. And every part of that sentence has to carry the word most likely, because she spent a lifetime making sure it could carry nothing firmer. Her father was a carpenter and machinist who died in 1859, leaving a widow, 5 children, and very little. Her mother took in boarders on a main street in Richmond, in a district of the wartime city thick with gambling parlors, cheap hotels, and worse. And to this day the accounts disagree about exactly what kind of house it was. That disagreement is not an accident of the record. It is the whole shape of the woman. Where others leave a trail, Arabella left a fog, and she made the fog on purpose. Watch what she did with her own name, because it tells you everything about the mind at work. She was Belle Yarrington to begin with. She became Belle Worsham, and called herself the widow of a Richmond gambling man named John Worsham, and stamped her linen and her silver with the letters B.D.W. She became Mrs. Collis Huntington. She became, at the very end, Mrs. Henry Huntington. She gave one birthplace to a ship's passenger list and a different one to a marriage register in Paris, 1 year here and another year there. And the dates she offered drifted later as she aged, so that on paper she grew younger while the calendar said otherwise. When she died, she had arranged for the bulk of her personal papers to be destroyed, and they were, by a trusted friend, over the protest of the man who loved her and did not understand why she would want her own letters burned. He should have known. She had told him in her way for decades. In a surviving letter, she signs herself with that maiden alias and ends with a plain instruction to the person reading it: do tear up this awful thing. It is the sentence under all the others. She was a woman who wrote and asked in the same breath that the writing not survive. She understood, earlier and colder than almost anyone in this story, that the record was the thing that could hurt you, that a paper trail was a rope someone else could pull, and that the surest way to keep power in a world built to take it back was to leave nothing behind that a man, a court, or a newspaper could hold against you. Hold that thought against the 4 women who come after her, because it is the thesis of the whole evening, stated once, at the start, by the one who beat the game. Every other woman in this film had the erasing done to her. Arabella did it to herself, first, and by choice, and it is precisely why she is the only one who kept everything. She looked at the machine, the law that wanted a man between a woman and her money, the society that would never fully open its door to a girl from a Richmond boarding house, the newspapers that would print a woman's past for the right reader, and she drew the only correct conclusion. If they were going to try to erase her anyway, she would erase herself, thoroughly, and on her own terms, and she would keep the fortune in the fog where no one could reach it. To feel how strange this is, you have to understand who she became while nobody was allowed to look. This foggy, self-deleting woman would end her life as, by common description, the richest woman in America. She would own the taste behind a collection of European art that now fills the wings of great museums on two coasts. She would be courted at different times by two of the wealthiest men the country produced, an uncle and his nephew, and marry them both. And through all of it, she would keep the one door bolted that mattered most to her, the door back to the main street in Richmond and the boarding house, and the girl with no certificate and no dowry and no name that society would rise for. She managed it with a discipline that reads, from a distance, as almost inhuman calm. In an undated letter from her middle years, she copies out a line of borrowed philosophy about mastering the self so completely that no loss and no disappointment can make you suffer, that you can give up anything. And she adds, in her own hand, that she needs all of this. It is a chilling little confession from the most controlled woman of the age. The self-command that let her surrender any feeling was the same command that let her surrender any fact about herself, cheerfully, whenever the truth might cost her. She had made a study of giving things up. The first thing she gave up was her own history. You can watch her doing it in the paper trail she could not entirely avoid leaving, and the contradictions are almost comic in their boldness. On a ship's passenger list, late in her life, she gave her birthplace as Mobile in Alabama, and a birth date in the winter of 1851. On her marriage register in Paris, for her second wedding, she gave a different Alabama town altogether, and a date in the summer of 1857, a full 6 years later than the ship. The same woman, 2 official documents, 2 different towns, 2 different years, and not the slightest concern that anyone might lay them side by side. That is not the carelessness of a woman who has forgotten the facts. It is the confidence of a woman who has decided the facts are hers to invent, that a birth is simply a story you tell, adjustable to the occasion, and that no clerk and no husband and no future historian has any right to a fixed answer. She had turned her own origin into a moving target, and she kept it moving to the end, so that even now the plainest questions about her, where and when she was born, come back not with an answer, but with a shrug. Look closely at the childhood, or at what little of it she allowed to remain, and you can see the trap she was determined to escape. Richmond in the war years was a hard city, swollen with soldiers and speculators, and the district where her widowed mother kept boarders was thick with the trades that grow up around desperate men, the gambling rooms and the cheap hotels, and the houses that were hotels in name only. A girl who grew up in that street learned early that a woman's face and manner were a kind of currency, the only currency a portionless girl was likely to hold, and she learned the exact price the world would pay for them, and the exact contempt it would keep in reserve for a woman who had traded on them. Arabella took both lessons and drew a conclusion colder than either. She would spend the currency once, on the biggest buyer she could find, and then she would burn every receipt. That is why the record of her is a record of erasures, one after another, each one deliberate. The maiden name, gone. The truth about the gambler she called her husband, gone. The city of her son's birth, gone. The year she was born, blurred, and then quietly moved. She stamped a false widow's initials on her linen and wore a dead man's name he had never given her. And at the very end, she set a match to the paper itself, arranging that her private letters be destroyed, and they were, faithfully, by a trusted friend, while the second husband who adored her stood by baffled, not understanding why any woman would want the evidence of her own life burned. He did not understand, because he had never had to. She understood, because she had grown up in a street that taught her the record was a weapon, and that the only safe amount of it to leave lying around was none. She did not learn this in a library. She learned it in the one room where a young woman with nothing could still be looked at, and could still be paid for the looking, and could still turn a rich man's attention into the seed of a fortune. To see how the boarding house girl came to be called the richest woman in America, We have to follow her into the years when she was still, in the eyes of the law and the newspapers, another man's mistress, and watch what she built while everyone assumed she was merely being kept. Chapter 3. The Mistress Who Bought the Taste of an Empire. While Collis Huntington was still married, a young woman with no past he would name was quietly building a fortune in her own name. Collis Huntington was one of the Big Four, the four men who drove the Central Pacific and then the Southern Pacific Railroad across the American West and grew monstrously rich doing it. And he was nearly 30 years older than she was. For years, she was his. In the arrangement, the century had 100 careful words for, and no honest one. He kept her. He set her up in fine houses. And this is the part the careful words are designed to hide. He gave her money that she did not spend on gowns and dinners, but turned, coolly, into more money. By the time she was 27, she owned property in her own name that would be worth, in today's money, something like $6.5 million. The mistress was already an investor. The kept woman was already, quietly, keeping herself. Her first husband, if he ever legally was her husband, complicates the fog further, and the complication is instructive. She always called herself the widow of John Worsham, the Richmond gambler, and wore that widowhood like a respectable coat. The records tell a different story. Worsham had a wife already, a woman named Annette, and he did not die when Arabella's account needed him to. He went back to Virginia and lived on for years. It is doubted the two of them ever legally married at all. So the respectable widowhood was another invention, another paper she had quietly torn up, and it sat over the deepest question of her life, the parentage of her only child. Her son was born on the 10th of March, 1870, and named Archer. The date is certain. Almost nothing else about his origin is. No record states the city of his birth or the name of his father. For the rest of the century, people would whisper that he was the splitting image of Collis Huntington, and that Collis was surely the true father, and Collis did treat him as a son and gave him the Huntington name. But no proof of it survives, and one careful modern historian has gone so far as to suggest that Belle herself may not have known who fathered her child. As a small boy, Archer was shipped off for long stretches to relatives in Texas, while his mother stayed north with Collis. The child, like the mother, spent his early years half erased, kept somewhere out of the frame. What she did with the fortune, once she had a great one to work with, is the surprise that overturns the whole idea of the kept woman. Elizabeth Huntington, Collis's first wife, died of cancer in 1883, and within about a year, Collis married Arabella. Now the mistress became the wife, and the wife became something the age had almost no category for: a serious collector, a genuine connoisseur, the real eye behind one of the greatest art fortunes America ever assembled. She taught herself French. She crossed to Paris to buy, again and again, at least 22 times across 4 decades. She dealt with the most powerful and most predatory art dealer of the era, Joseph Duveen. And she did not deal with him as a rich man's ornament. She dealt as a buyer who knew exactly what she wanted. Consider one afternoon of her spending, because it makes the scale real. In 1907, the whole celebrated collection of a Paris financier named Kane came onto the market through Duveen, and Arabella walked into it and bought, among other things, a Rembrandt, the great canvas of Aristotle contemplating a bust of Homer, along with a mass of French decorative art, for a sum that in today's money runs to something like $16 million. $16 million in an afternoon, chosen by a woman the newspapers still thought of, when they thought of her at all, as the mystery wife with no past. The judgment of the leading modern scholar of the family is blunt and worth repeating. The Huntingtons' collection of French 18th century art, she writes, is imbued with the taste, the knowledge, and the guidance of Arabella. The taste was hers. The men signed the checks. The hands on that collection were hers. The dealer she worked with was a force of nature in his own right, and the way he handled the Huntington money tells you who in that marriage actually had the eye. Joseph Duveen was the greatest art dealer of the age, and a shameless one, and his favourite trick with the very rich was simply to ship them a masterpiece they had not asked for and let the object do the selling. He once sent an enormous bronze across the country unannounced, writing that he had ventured to take the bull by the horns and mail it along for their inspection, and the family bought it, and 3 more like it. He did the same with a carload of garden marbles that simply arrived one day, so that the master of the house cabled in bafflement to ask what the shipment of marbles even was, and then bought those too. That was how Duveen worked the men. He did not work Arabella that way, because Arabella knew more than he did about half of what he sold, and her own son, watching the dealer circle his mother's fortune, called him plainly a pirate. She was the one client Duveen could not simply dazzle, because she had taught herself, over decades and 22 crossings, to see. She was not only buying, she was, in her own way, arriving, and in one city at least she was welcomed. Old New York would never quite take her, but in San Francisco, on Nob Hill, in the great house of the railroad kings, she threw a run of dinners in a Spanish style that became a genuine society fashion, praised in the papers, imitated by her betters. It was the closest she came to being received on her own terms, and it was 3,000 miles from the closed doors of Fifth Avenue. That distance mattered. A woman could be a queen in one city and a roomer in another, and Arabella lived on both maps at once, always calculating which face to show. And she built, over some 20 years, roughly 8 great residences, and the story of one of them is the story of the whole woman. Before her marriage, while she was still the mistress with the buried past, she bought a house on West 54th Street and rebuilt its insides into a fantasy of arrival. She lined it with rare woods and a stained glass skylight, put in a Moorish smoking room and a Turkish bath and a Japanese bedroom, and installed one of the first private elevators in any New York home. All of it the decorating of a woman teaching herself, room by room, how a great lady was supposed to live. Then, when she married Collis and moved up in the world, she sold the whole house, furnished, to the Rockefellers, and it passed out of her hands. Here is the uncanny afterlife of it. When that house was finally torn down, its finest rooms were saved and carried into the museums, so that today you can walk into the Brooklyn Museum and stand in her Moorish smoking room, or into the Metropolitan and stand in the dressing room she designed, or into the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in the very city of her birth and stand in her bedroom. The rooms the boarding house girl built to rehearse being a lady survive as public exhibits. The lady who built them is a caption on the wall, if she is named at all. There was a grander house still, the great mansion Collis commissioned for her at the corner of 5th Avenue and 57th Street, a palace by one of the leading architects of the age, and it too is gone, pulled down, its corner now the ground under a famous jeweller's shop. The pattern is worth marking, because it will repeat with every woman in this film. The stone she stood in, the rooms she made, the corner she commanded, all of it was kept or sold or demolished and remembered as somebody's real estate. The taste that shaped it, the will that ordered it, the woman who lived inside it, quietly evaporated from the story of the address. And underneath the connoisseur and the hostess, the frightened boarding house girl was still keeping accounts. There survives a letter from the very start of it all, from 1871, written in her alias while her infant son lay sick far away in Texas, and it is the rawest thing in the whole record of her. She writes to Collis that she is so worried she does not know what to do, that she is ashamed to ask him. But he has been so kind that he is the only friend she has in the world. And then the line that tells you what the arrangement really was, that she is perfectly willing to agree to any proposition he may make. That is the deal at its origin, laid bare in her own hand. A desperate young mother offering the only thing she had to offer to the only man who could save her child. Everything after it, the Rembrandt, the Spanish dinners, the millions in her own name, grew from that one letter and the bargain inside it. She never forgot the bargain. She simply made sure that she, and not the man, ended up holding the fortune it produced. But a fortune could not buy her the one thing she wanted most, and the effort to hide the reason why would nearly drag her whole buried past into the daylight. Chapter 4. She paid to keep her own history buried. In 1903, the woman the papers were already calling the richest in America handed a blackmailer $10,000 and then fled the country to dodge a subpoena. The blackmailer was a colonel named Mann, who ran the Society Gossip Weekly and a vanity book called Fads and Fancies, and whose whole business was knowing what the very rich would pay to keep quiet. Most who bought their way into his flattering pages paid a modest fee. Arabella paid $10,000, a sum that in today's money would be something like $250,000, many times the going rate, and the size of the payment is itself the confession. She was not buying vanity. She was buying silence. And when the law began circling Mann's operation, and a subpoena threatened to put her under oath about her own history, she did the thing she always did when a paper trail came too close. She left. She sailed for Europe in 1905 and put an ocean between herself and the questions. Think about what that means from a woman of her wealth. She could command the taste of an empire and the price of a Rembrandt, and she could not afford, at any price, to have her origins spoken aloud in an American courtroom. The fortune was enormous, and the fear was enormous, and the fear was older than the fortune. What was she so anxious to conceal that she would pay a fortune and cross an ocean to bury it? The honest answer, given even by the institution that keeps her memory today, is that we will probably never know, because she made sure of it. The erasure worked. That is the point. The proof that she succeeded is that we are still guessing. Her second act sealed the fortune and, in a way, the fog with it. Collis Huntington had died in 1900, leaving her, by the terms of his will, roughly 2/3 of an estate that ran into the tens of millions, while his nephew Henry took the other third. For a widow, that would have been the end of the arithmetic. For Arabella, it was a merger waiting to happen. In 1913, in a church in Paris, she married that nephew, Henry Huntington, and the two halves of the Huntington fortune, the uncles and the nephews, closed back into one pair of hands, hers. Henry adored her. In a letter of that year, he wrote that the word home, to a man who had gone a long time without one, was inexpressibly sweet, that it felt as though he were only just beginning to live. She had that effect. She also had, by then, more money concentrated in her own person than almost any woman alive. The marriage was not universally welcomed, and the resistance came, tellingly, from the women of the family, who could read the situation better than the men. One of Henry's own relations wrote plainly that he was madly in love with Aunt Belle, and among the wives and daughters of the Huntington circle, a distinct bitterness and dislike of Arabella had already set in years before the wedding. They saw a woman with no past she would name, a mistress turned wife, turned widow, turned wife again, gathering both halves of the great family fortune into her own hands, and they did not trouble to hide what they thought of it. Arabella, who had spent her life being disapproved of by better-born women, absorbed it as she absorbed everything, without a flicker, and married him anyway, and took the money anyway, and let the disapproval slide off the polished surface she had spent decades building. She had learned long ago that a woman in her position would never win affection from the world she was climbing into. The most she could hope to win was the fortune, and that she took with both hands. And still, the door stayed shut. For all of it, the two great marriages, the collection, the millions, the Astors and the Vanderbilts never truly received her, and she knew exactly why. And she wore the knowledge, like the black she never took off. She had gone into mourning for Collis when he died, and she never really came out of it, keeping to widow's black in public for the rest of her life, even after she had married Henry, so that she moved through her second marriage dressed for the loss of her first husband. It is one of the strangest images in the whole story, a bride in a widow's weeds, and it tells you where her heart, or at least her memory, had lodged. She died on the 16th of September, 1924, in her house on Fifth Avenue. And here, the woman who spent a lifetime erasing when and where she was born delivered the last and most perfect proof of her success. When it came time to build her tomb and carve her dates into the stone, the man who had loved her did not know them. Henry Huntington had to write to her own son, to Archer, to ask his own late wife's true date of birth, because she had hidden it so completely that even her husband could not supply it for her grave. She had erased herself so thoroughly that her monument could not, at first, state when she had lived. There is no colder measure of a life spent disappearing on purpose. There is a colder one, if you want it. She does not even lie beside the man she wore black for. Collis Huntington rests in a great mausoleum at Woodlawn, in the Bronx. Arabella lies 3,000 miles away in California, beside Henry. Years later, a marker bearing her name was set next to Collis in New York, but it is a cenotaph, an empty stone, her name at his side and her body a continent away. Even in death she is in two places, and fully present in neither, exactly as she lived, a woman on two maps, and pinned to neither one. What she left behind is as double-edged as everything else about her. She had a genuine hand in good works, and they were not small. She gave $100,000 to found what became one of the first cancer research funds in the country, an institution that grew into one of the great cancer hospitals in the world. And she put money into schools for black students at a time when few of her class would. The connoisseur had a conscience, or at least an instinct for the kind of giving that might, in time, wash a name clean. But even her memorial is a portrait of erasure. When she died, her adoring second husband wanted to keep her taste alive, and so he turned to the same dealer she had made rich, Joseph Duveen, and asked him to assemble a collection in her honor. Duveen gathered 116 pieces of the French 18th century art she had loved in a matter of months, and the husband spent a fortune on it, something in today's money past $30 million. And here is the quiet heartbreak in it. Most of those objects were never hers. They were representative pieces, chosen to evoke a woman's taste, standing in for the real possessions that had been scattered. Her monument is a collection of things she never owned, arranged to remind the world of a woman it was already forgetting. She had, in the end, aged backward into pure fog. On paper, she had grown younger year by year as the real calendar advanced, until she could joke to her son that her birthday had passed, and she was now officially 50 when she was well past 60. The lie about her age had become so habitual that it was almost play. But the play had a cost that only death revealed: the husband who could not carve her birth date, the tomb that could not, at first, say when she had lived. She had won the game so completely that even the people who loved her could not find her in it. That is what victory looked like for a woman in her world. She kept the fortune, the art, the second marriage, everything. And she kept it by doing to her own history precisely what the age would do, again and again, to the women who came after her. She erased herself first, so that no one else could. The 4 women still ahead of us did not have her discipline, or her luck, or her cold, clear willingness to burn every letter and lie about every date. They reached the same kind of power she did, and when the men were gone, the erasing was done to them by other hands, and they could not stop it. The next of them had millions of her own and adored the whole country, and still could not save her own name from a single motion picture. Chapter 5. The chorus girl, the front row, could not stop watching. She was 19, and she stammered. And a man in his early 50s sat in the front row of the Follies night after night to watch her dance. That is the picture the legend keeps. And the legend, for once, is roughly true. The man was William Randolph Hearst, who already owned newspapers across the country and would soon own more. And the girl he could not stop watching had been born Marion Cecilia Davies in Brooklyn on the 3rd of January, 1897. The first thing to correct is the thing the movies got wrong on purpose. She was not a slum waif, and she was not a nobody. Her father was a New York lawyer who became a city magistrate. Her family was Irish and Catholic and respectable, and she was schooled by nuns, and the poverty and the vacancy that would later be painted onto her were painted from outside. What was true was the stammer. She stuttered badly from childhood, and children are cruel about such things, and she carried the wound and the wit that grew over it for the rest of her life. When she got a little older, she remembered, her mother decided she was a kind of problem, because no school wanted a girl who stuttered, and when she stood up to recite, the other children laughed. She turned the wound into comic timing. Before an early audition, her mother corrected her, telling her the word was stammer, not stutter, and the girl shot back that she did not see what difference it made. Stutter or stammer, it came to the same thing. She would spend a career being told what she was, and answering back that the label did not change the fact of her. Even the famous name was borrowed, and borrowed from the street. Doris became Davies when her older sister Rainey took the new surname off a real estate sign in the neighborhood, and Marion followed her into it. She left school early, danced in the chorus, modelled for the magazine illustrators whose pretty girls defined the look of the age, and by 1916 she had a featured place in the Ziegfeld Follies, the most glittering revue in America. The stammer kept her to dancing rather than speaking parts, which turned out to be a mercy in the silent era to come. She said it herself, later, with the dry honesty that was her real signature. She could not act, she liked to say, but the idea of silent pictures appealed to her, because she could not talk either. Then Hearst built her a studio. Not a role, not a contract with another man's company, an entire film company, Cosmopolitan Productions, raised up around this one young woman so that she could be made into a star. He signed her at $500 a week at a time when the stage had been paying her $45 or $50. And she took the contract, she said, for exactly that plain reason. And then the machine began. Hearst poured money into making the public love her, an estimated $7 million of promotion across the years, a sum that in today's money runs past $150 million, an ocean of newsprint and billboards and praise. Her pictures were mounted lavishly. When knighthood was in flower, in 1922, with Marion as a Tudor princess, became the first million-dollar film to turn a profit. By 1924, she was the #1 woman at the American box office, and the exhibitors crowned her Queen of the Screen. Here is the cruel joke buried in all that promotion. And she saw it before anyone. The love was manufactured so loudly that it curdled. She remembered the signs going up all over New York City, block after block of them, until people got so sick of the name Marion Davies that they would stop her in the street to insult her. The empire that could make a name could also wear it out, and a woman whose fame was pumped through 100 front pages learned that the public could feel the pump and resent it and turn. She had a real gift, and the gift was getting buried under the very machine built to display it. Film historians now, looking back, put it plainly. She was one of the best comedians the silent screen produced. In her own time, the comedian kept vanishing behind the headline. The work itself was enormous, whatever the later story pretended. Across roughly 20 years, she made something near 45 feature films, close to 3 a year at the peak, and she was always the star, always the top of the bill. She played a Tudor princess, and again, the light comic heroine. And when the pictures learned to talk, the industry assumed her stammer would finish her, and it did not. Her sound test came back so strong that a great studio signed her for 5 more years, and she found she could master the stutter in front of a camera, even when she could not always master it at a dinner table. Hearst set her up at that studio in a private bungalow of 14 rooms, a dressing room the size of a house. And for a while the arrangement worked. Then it broke, and it broke over exactly the thing that had built her, a rich man forcing a career. Hearst wanted her cast as Marie Antoinette, and in the great tragic role of another prestige picture, and both parts went instead to Norma Shearer, the wife of the studio's own boy genius of a producer. Hearst took the refusal as an insult, pulled the enormous weight of his newspapers away from that studio, and moved Marion and her whole film company across town to Warner Brothers. It was a titanic gesture of loyalty, and it did her no good at all, because the parts at the new studio were thinner, and the public had moved on, and by the end of the 1930s, her film company had quietly folded, and she had left the screen for good, at around 40 years old. The machine that had spent $7 million making her a star simply switched off. What almost no one noticed, because it did not fit the story of the kept woman, was how much of her own fortune she had built with her own head while all this went on. She was a shrewd buyer of property, a genuinely successful investor in Los Angeles land and buildings, and she drove a hard bargain on beautiful things too. There is a story of her wanting a great English portrait that a famous dealer meant to sell to another rich woman, and beating him down from $600,000 to $140,000 and winning the painting. And the losing bidder was said to have fallen into such a rage that she tumbled down a staircase and broke her leg. That was Marion Davies away from the camera, quick, funny, and cold-eyed about money. The empty-headed mistress was a role someone else wrote for her. The woman keeping the books was real, and she did have the gift, whatever the caricature would later say. Watch her in the comedies she made at the height of it, and you see a woman with real timing, a mimic who could lampoon the grand stars of her own day to their faces, a light and quick and self-mocking presence that the camera loved. In one celebrated picture, she does a whole series of impressions of the reigning dramatic queens of the screen, sending up their grand poses and swooning close-ups with a wicked accuracy that only a real comedian could manage, and audiences howled because the girl who could not always get a sentence out at a dinner table could, in front of a camera, become anyone she liked. That was the paradox of her, and it is the paradox the caricature erased. The stammer that had shamed her as a child and kept her out of speaking parts turned out to sit beside a gift for physical comedy and mimicry that few of her rivals could touch. She was funny in the way that is hardest to fake, funny with her whole body and her whole face, and the industry that later agreed to remember her as a talentless drunk had, at the time, crowned her the queen of its screen, and lined up to watch her clown. The record of the laughter is still there, on the film, for anyone who cares to look. It simply stopped being the story anyone told. The tragedy already forming around her had nothing to do with a shortage of talent. The talent was there, and it was being smothered in adoration, because the man who loved her was so determined to prove she was a great dramatic actress that he kept aiming her at the heavy costume parts that fought her real gift, while a public exhausted by the sheer volume of her publicity was being taught, in advance, to disbelieve her. All of that was in place before the disaster that finished the argument for good. But the disaster is later. First, there is the thing almost no one remembers about Marion Davies, the thing that turns the whole kept woman story inside out, the year she opened her own accounts and saved him. Chapter 6. $1 million check against a caricature. By 1937, the richest publisher in America was more than $100 million in debt, and the woman the world called his kept mistress wrote the check that saved him. The numbers around Hearst had finally caught up with him. The depression, the overreach, the castles and the collecting and the endless buying had left him owing $126 million, and the empire that had made Marion a star was days from collapse. And Marion Davies, the supposed ornament, the girl who was meant to be nothing but a pretty dependent, sat down and wrote him a personal check for $1 million. When that was not enough, she gave him her jewelry, the diamonds, and the whole glittering evidence of what the world assumed he had lavished on her, handed back to be sold to keep him afloat. Hold on the strangeness of that, because it inverts the entire arrangement the age was built to enforce. She did not need his money. She had made millions of her own, in films and more shrewdly in real estate, buying buildings and land with the cold good sense that the kept woman was never supposed to possess. She could have walked. Instead, she liquidated her own security to rescue the man, and the jewels that were meant to be the badge of her dependence became, in one stroke, the proof of the opposite. They were not what he gave her. They were what she gave up for him. In the whole record of these 5 women, it is the single clearest reversal of the story everyone thought they were watching. The mistress bailed out the magnate. The hands on the rescue were hers. Why did she do it when she could have saved herself and let him fall? The answer is the least fashionable one, and the true one. She loved him, and had for 20 years, and had built a whole life beside him that the law would never let her make official. They never married, across roughly 3 decades together, for one reason. Hearst had a wife, Millicent, a Catholic, who would not divorce him. Once he came close to buying his freedom and balked at the price she named. So Marion lived as the companion who could not be the wife, welcomed nowhere as Mrs. Hearst, and she made her peace with it in words that are almost unbearably plain. A friend remembered her saying she would give everything she had to marry that silly old man, not for the money or the security, because he had already given her more than she would ever need, but because he gave her the feeling that she was worth something to him. She knew about the wife. She knew the rules. He could be petty, she said, and he snored, and he had sons nearly her own age, but he was kind to her, and she would never walk out on him. When the crash came, she did not. While the men counted their losses, she ran the part of the empire that could not be measured in dollars, its social power, from 2 of the most extraordinary houses in America. There was San Simeon up the California coast, the hilltop castle of about 165 rooms that Hearst built over the better part of 30 years, and there was the house that was truly hers to command, Ocean House, on the sand at Santa Monica. Ocean House was a fantasy. It ran to something like 110 rooms, with as many as 55 bathrooms and 37 fireplaces, $4 million spent on the furnishings alone, 3 guest houses, 2 swimming pools, a staff of 32, and a long marble saltwater pool crossed by a bridge modelled on the Rialto in Venice. They called it the Versailles of Hollywood, and Marion was its queen. And through those rooms, she pulled the whole century. Picture an evening at the beach house, the pool lit, the marble bridge glowing, and coming across it the faces that ran the age. Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks and Greta Garbo and Clark Gable from the studios. Winston Churchill and a president, Calvin Coolidge from the world of power. Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart from the newer, stranger frontier of the sky. Marion Davies, the girl the front row could not stop watching, stood at the center of it, stammer and all, and made the most powerful people alive feel that the party mattered because she was in it. That was a form of power too, the power to gather, to charm, to be the reason the important ones came. It was the least ownable kind. It left no deed and no share certificate. It could be taken from her without anyone signing a thing. She never seems to have minded the one thing the world assumed must have gnawed at her, which was that she could not be his wife. Asked about the arrangement, she said simply that she had been very happy the way they were, that she had respect for him and he for her, that they were together, and that was all that mattered. Whether that was the whole truth or the brave surface over a private ache, it held for 30 years, which is longer than most marriages of the age lasted, and it held without a ring or a legal claim or a single protection the law would recognize. She had built her whole life on the goodwill of one man and the sufferance of his refusing wife, and she had done it with open eyes, and she asked for no pity then or later. That refusal of self-pity is the thing the caricature could never capture, and the thing that makes the caricature such an insult, because the real woman met a hard, unequal bargain with more grace than the men around her ever managed. The greater of the two houses was almost beyond belief, and it was the work of a woman which the age also managed to forget. San Simeon, the hilltop castle up the coast, was designed for Hearst by the architect Julia Morgan, and she laboured over it for the better part of 30 years, raising a fantasy of towers and pools and imported ceilings on a bare California hill. It held some 165 rooms, and Hearst filled it with whole shipments of Europe, and it cost a fortune no one has ever quite settled. A visiting playwright looked at the whole staggering thing and said the line that stuck to it forever, that this was what God would have built if he had the money. And moving through it, its hostess, its warmth, the reason the famous came and stayed, was Marion, a Brooklyn judge's daughter with a stammer, presiding over the grandest private house in America as though she had been born to it. The eerie thing that hangs over those golden years. And it belongs here because it shows how a woman near a great man becomes a rumour even in her own life, is the death of a man named Thomas Ince. In the autumn of 1924, Ince, a film producer, was among a party aboard Hearst's yacht when he was taken violently ill, and he died soon after. And the official finding was plain enough: a failing heart and an attack of acute indigestion. But Hollywood could not leave it plain. A whisper started and never fully died that Hearst had shot him, that there had been a pistol and a jealous rage, that Hearst had suspected an affair around Marion and fired at the wrong man in the dark. There is no proof of any of it, not a shred that stands up, and the grounded explanation, a sick man dying of natural causes at sea, remains the only one the evidence supports. But notice what the legend needed in order to run. It needed Marion, placed at the centre of a violent secret she almost certainly had nothing to do with. A woman turned into the silent cause of a man's death by nothing but her nearness to power. Even the ghost stories of her life are stories in which she is the object and never the author. The verdict on that night is best left open, but the shape of the rumor is its own kind of evidence of how the age loved to make a woman the dark heart of a mystery she never chose. She had given him $1 million and her jewels and 30 years and the animating warmth of every room he owned. What she would get back, in the end, was a house emptied overnight and a closed church door. But the theft of her name came first, and it came not from Hearst, who loved her, but from a young stranger with a camera and a genius for cruelty, who put a drunk and talentless woman in a lonely castle, called her something else, and taught the entire country to see Marion Davies whenever they looked at her. Chapter 7. A film teaches a country to forget her. In 1941, a young man named Orson Welles put a talentless drunk in a lonely castle and called her Susan Alexander, and the country decided she was Marion Davies. Citizen Kane is one of the greatest films ever made, and it was also, for one living woman, a weapon. Its hero, Charles Foster Kane, is unmistakably built on Hearst, a titan of newspapers who builds a fantasy castle he names Xanadu, and installs there a second wife he forces into a career she has no gift for, a woman who ends the picture drunk and alone, assembling enormous jigsaw puzzles in the empty halls. Audiences did the arithmetic the film invited them to do. Kane was Hearst, Xanadu was San Simeon, and Susan Alexander, the talentless, drinking, imprisoned mistress figure, was Marion Davies. The biographers say it without hedging. The release of Citizen Kane destroyed Marion Davies's reputation. The cruelty is in the detail, and the detail was stolen from her life and twisted. The real Marion did drink, and drank more as the good years ended, and the film took that private sorrow and made it her defining trait. The real Marion, it is said, liked to do jigsaw puzzles, and the film took that too, and turned a woman's harmless pastime into the emblem of a hollow, kept, purposeless life. The picture reached into a real person and pulled out a few true fragments and rebuilt them into a lie the whole country could see for a dime. Hearst understood exactly what had been done. His papers banned so much as a mention of the film. But you cannot ban a masterpiece, and the masterpiece won, and the woman lost, and the comedienne with the real gift was buried under a fictional drunk who could not sing. Think, for a moment, about the puzzle. Because of all the cruelties in that film, it is the one that turned out to be a kind of accidental prophecy. In the picture, the discarded woman sits alone in the vast, cold halls of the castle, fitting together enormous jigsaw puzzles, piece after piece, a portrait of a life with nothing left in it but the killing of time. It was meant as contempt, and it landed as contempt, and it fixed Marion Davies in the public mind as an empty woman assembling nothing in an empty house. And yet look what the decades since have actually done with her. Historians and critics have spent 70 years doing exactly what the fictional woman was mocked for, sitting down with the scattered pieces of Marion Davies, the surviving films, the memoir, the friend's testimony, the bank records, the $1 million check, and slowly, patiently, fitting them back together into the shape of the real person the film erased. The jigsaw was the insult. The jigsaw became the rescue. Putting her back together, piece by piece, is the only apology history has been able to offer her, and she did not live to see a single piece set in place. The record eventually tried to correct itself, too late to help her. The very men who made the film came to regret what it had done to her. Herman Mankiewicz, who wrote it and had been her friend, was said to count it among his deepest regrets that people thought his Susan was Marion. And Welles himself, decades on, recanted in public and in print. Long after her death, he wrote the introduction to her own memoir, and there he called Marion Davies one of the most delightfully accomplished comedians in the whole history of the screen, and said flatly that his Susan Alexander bore no resemblance to her at all. It was a generous thing to write. It was also an admission that the most famous film in America had spent its genius, in part, on erasing a real woman and replacing her with a cartoon. The apology could not reach the millions who had already learned the cartoon by heart. She bore it with a grace that is almost harder to watch than anger would be. She refused to hate the man who had done it. She said she had no anger toward Orson Welles, that everyone is made to do their very best, and who was she to say she did not like the way he had made his picture? She liked, she said, to keep the waters calm. That was Marion, keeping the waters calm while a masterpiece drowned her good name. Then the man she had saved began to die, and the end laid the whole pattern bare. Hearst declined for years, and she nursed him through it, and on the 14th of August, 1951, he died at their house in Beverly Hills, 88 years old. What his will left her was, for a moment, real power. A great block of controlling shares in the Hearst Corporation, 170,000 of them, along with a smaller holding in a trust. But within weeks, she signed the controlling shares over to his widow, Millicent, for the sum of $1, and stepped back into the shadows she had lived in for 30 years. And her own account of the days around his death is the thing that stays with you. She told it that she had been persuaded, exhausted, to take a sedative, and that while she slept, Hearst died, and his sons moved through the house and stripped it of every trace of their father, and that she, the woman who had nursed him to the end and once saved him from ruin, was not even told of the funeral. She woke, and he was gone, and so was every sign that he had ever been there, and the door was closed to her. Whatever the exact truth of that morning, and it comes to us in her telling, its shape is the truth of her life. She had reached the center of one of the great American fortunes, and held its owner's heart for 3 decades, and rescued it with her own money, and when the man was gone, she was swept out of the record of it as if she had been a guest who overstayed. What survives of her greatest house says the rest without a word. Ocean House, the Versailles of Hollywood, was sold and then largely torn down. But the long marble pool remained, and the bridge over it, out on the Santa Monica sand, and they stand there still, a strip of ruined splendor where the public now swims, the last bright fragment of an empire's playground, outliving the empire and the woman both. What she did next tells you how bereft she was, and how game. 11 weeks and a day after Hearst died, she married a sea captain named Horace Brown, in a rush that friends read as pure loneliness, a grab at any warm body in the sudden silence of a life built entirely around one man. The marriage was unhappy, and she twice began to leave it, and twice did not. Even there, she kept her wit intact. Asked once why she had taken the man back, she said she supposed it was because he was standing right beside her, crying, and added, "Thank God we all have a sense of humor." That was the engine that had carried her through everything. The stammer and the billboards and the caricature and the closed church door, a refusal to let any of it turn her cruel or self-pitying. The body gave out slowly, as it does. There was a stroke, which she waved off with a joke about blondes falling apart, and then, at the very end, a cancer of the jaw, and she died in the autumn of 1961, 64 years old, and was buried in Hollywood. She had spent her last comfortable years quietly, and she had spent real money well, more than $1 million to children's charities in her great days, and, later, close to $2 million to build a children's clinic that still treats the sick in Los Angeles under a newer name. And she had done one last thing, in secret, into a tape recorder, telling the true story of her life with Hearst in her own dry voice, a memoir that was published only after she was gone. When it came out, the man who had done her the most harm wrote its introduction, and Orson Welles used those pages to say, in print, that Marion Davies was one of the most delightfully accomplished comedians the screen had ever produced, and that his cruel Susan Alexander bore her no resemblance at all. Slowly, over the decades since, the critics and the historians have caught up with what her friends always knew, and the real Marion, the mimic, the investor, the loyal heart, the woman who wrote the $1 million check, has been pieced back together out from under the fiction. A recent film even set the record straight for a new audience. The rehabilitation is real. It is also, every word of it, posthumous. None of it reached her while she lived to feel the sting of the lie. She kept her fortune and her comfort to the end, which is more than the next woman managed, and far more than the woman after that. What she lost was her name, replaced in the national memory by a fiction. But losing the name while keeping the money was, in the brutal accounting of these lives, a soft landing. The next woman reached the richest man in New York with nothing but her bare hands and a reputation for magic, sat him on his own knee, and when he died, his family went further than forgetting. They bought her a ticket and put her on a ship and moved her out of the country and out of the story entirely. Chapter 8. The Healer Who Sat on the Commodore's Knee. A month after his wife died, the 74-year-old richest man in America sent for a fortune-teller's daughter to lay her hands on him. The man was Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, who had built a fortune in steamships and railroads that would make him, by the end, worth something near $100 million, a sum with almost no equal in the country. The fortune-teller's daughter was Tennessee Claflin, called Tennie, and to understand how a barefoot girl from Homer, Ohio, came to lay hands on the greatest fortune in America, you have to start in the traveling medicine shows of her childhood, because that is where she learned the only trade that would ever open a rich man's door to her. She was born in the mid-1840s, one of a swarm of children of a man named Buck Claflin, whom even the plainest histories call a snake oil salesman who posed as a doctor. He was, by the family's own record, a violent father, and the children grew up poor and wild and hungry. And Buck's answer to poverty was to put his daughters to work as performers of the uncanny. Inspired by the famous Fox sisters, who had convinced half the country that the dead could rap out messages on a table, Buck advertised his girls as mediums, and they became the family's living. He billed little Tennie as the wonder child. He billed himself grandly and monstrously as a king of cancer, and sold a worthless tonic under her name. There was a darker chapter still, a clinic in Illinois where the family's quackery was blamed for a patient's death and the whole clan had to flee. This was the school Tennie was raised in, the school of reading a mark, of laying on hands, of telling frightened people what they needed to hear. It was also, though no one could have guessed it, the perfect training for the drawing rooms of the rich. Because the rich, in that age, were hungry for exactly what the Claflins were selling. Spiritualism was not a fringe amusement. It ran right up into the great houses, and the greatest house of all belonged to the Commodore who believed. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the hardest man on Wall Street, kept faith with mediums for years. He made pilgrimages to a spiritualist through whom he believed he could speak with the dead, with his own mother, and, so the accounts say, with the shade of George Washington himself. He believed he was haunted, and paid to be rid of two ghosts in particular, a boy he had run down with his fast trotting horses near the Central Park Reservoir, and a railroad worker cut apart under the wheels of one of his own trains. This is the grounded truth beneath the strangeness. A brutal old titan, afraid of the dead, went looking for someone whose hands could quiet them. Whether anything crossed over is a question the record leaves open. What is certain is that he wanted to be touched by someone who claimed the power, and in the autumn of 1868, barely a month after his first wife died, that someone was Tennie Claflin. What passed between them after that is the most hedged material in this whole film, and honesty requires that the hedges stay on. The affair, and the money, were denied at the time and never admitted by either of them, and much of what we have comes from servants' gossip, a doctor's private notes, and later courtroom testimony. With that warning firmly in place, here is what the biographers, weighing it all, have concluded. The two of them became lovers. She was his magnetic healer, brought in to work her hands on his aged body, and the servants, the story goes, grew used to finding her in the old man's bed in the morning. He called her his little sparrow. In his downtown office, where the business of a national empire was done, he would sit her on his knee and bounce her there while he talked railroads, and let her tug his whiskers and call him old boy. His own physician, watching, said the old man was often childish now, and lucky to have so willing a plaything to divert him while abler men ran his affairs. That is the picture, as close as the record allows. The most feared capitalist in America, with a fortune-teller's daughter on his knee, being called old boy. And out of that knee came something no woman had ever built before. Vanderbilt backed the sisters, Tennie and her elder sister Victoria Woodhull, in setting themselves up as stockbrokers. And in the opening weeks of 1870, they opened the doors of Woodhull, Claflin and Company on Broad Street, across from the Stock Exchange, the first brokerage in American history run by women. The city lost its mind. On the first day, some 4,000 people crowded to see them, and it took about 100 policemen to hold the crush. The papers called them the bewitching brokers and the queens of finance, half in wonder and half in sneer. A sign in their office reportedly warned the gentlemen callers to state their business and then retire at once. A woman ordering men to say their piece and leave in the very temple of male money. Where the money to do it came from was never openly admitted, and Vanderbilt's friends publicly denied he had a hand in it. But everyone in the street knew whose fortune stood behind the two women, and Tennie, asked point-blank about it by a reporter, gave the answer of someone who had learned exactly how much to say. The Commodore, she said, was her friend, and she would say nothing more about that matter. To feel how strange her rise was, you have to sit for a moment with the childhood, because nothing in it pointed at Wall Street. She had been advertised as a child, a fortune-teller for $1 a sitting, working long days, while her father sold a worthless tonic under her name and billed himself the king of a disease he could not touch. There had been a clinic in Illinois where the family treated cancer with caustic lye that burned the patients, and where one of them died, and where the whole clan fled ahead of the law, with a girl barely 18 left carrying the gravest of the blame. This was the training, the reading of frightened faces, the laying on of hands, the confident lie told gently, and it prepared her for exactly 2 rooms in American life, the tent of the medicine show and the parlor of the very rich, which turned out to be nearer to one another than either would admit. And the parlor took her in. Once the Commodore's money was behind them, the sisters did not stop at broking. Their office on Broad Street became a spectacle in itself, and the clientele that climbed its stairs told the truth about who in that city actually wanted a woman to handle their money: the society wives and the widows, the school teachers, the small shopkeepers, and, the papers noted with relish, the more prosperous women of the town's demi-monde and the madams who banked their earnings. The illustrated weeklies drew the two sisters as the bewitching brokers and crowned them the queens of finance, half marveling and half warning the public against them. And the sheer novelty of two women commanding the sidewalk in front of the stock exchange drew crowds for weeks. They took the fortune that flowed through their hands and poured a great part of it into a newspaper of their own, and used the newspaper to say every unsayable thing: votes for women, a woman's right to leave a loveless marriage, reform of the whole money system, until respectable New York did not know whether to be scandalized by their morals or their politics or their existence. Under all of it ran the current of the uncanny, which was not a costume they put on, but the actual medium of their power, and it reached its strangest expression in the old man himself. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who could break a rival without blinking, was privately terrified of the dead, and paid mediums to lay his ghosts, and believed he was hounded by the shade of a boy his fast horses had trampled, and the shade of a workman cut apart beneath one of his own trains. Into that haunted, frightened old age walked Tennie with her warm hands and her tent show patter and her gift for telling a scared man exactly what he needed to hear, and whether or not anything crossed over from the other side. Something in him steadied when she was near. Her power over the richest man in America was real, and it was built out of exactly the thing the respectable world most despised her for: the séance, the healing touch, the traffic with the dead. The grounded truth is simple and a little sad. A brutal old man was afraid to die, and a poor girl who had been trained since childhood to comfort the desperate was the one person who could quiet him, and he paid her in the only coin he had too much of, which was money and access to the machinery of a fortune. She would, though, say a great deal about her own power, and soon, in a courtroom, she would say the most dangerous, true thing a woman of her age could say out loud, and it would help set in motion the machinery that ended by putting her on a boat. Chapter 9. They bought her a ticket out of the record. When the richest man in America died, the sisters who had held his ear were suddenly named as witnesses, and just as suddenly they were gone to England. But between the knee and the boat, there were a few extraordinary years, because Tennie and Victoria did not use the Commodore's money only to play at broking. They used it to become the loudest women in America. They founded a newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, and turned it into a battering ram for every idea respectable people feared: votes for women, free love, spiritualism, reform of the money system. In the last days of 1871, the Weekly printed the first American edition of the Communist Manifesto, carrying Karl Marx into American parlors between advertisements for stocks. These were, for a moment, a genuine power in the land. Two women who had been dismissed as kept playthings and had turned themselves into a force respectable men were afraid of. And the whole enterprise was bankrolled by the fortune Tennie had reached with her healer's hands. The courtroom line came in the spring of 1871, in the middle of a family lawsuit that dragged the Commodore's name into open court. And it is the truest thing anyone in this film ever said about the shadow trade these women worked. Under oath, Tennie declared that she was a clairvoyant and a spiritualist, that she had power, and she knew her power, that many of the best men in the street knew her power, and, she said it right out, that Commodore Vanderbilt knew her power. She admitted in the same breath that she had humbugged people, but insisted that when she did it to make money. Hold that sentence, because we will come back to it at the very end. I have power, and I know my power. It is the confession the whole age was arranged to prevent a woman from making, and she made it in a courtroom about the richest man in the country. Saying it out loud was the beginning of the end for her. The next year, the Weekly lit the fuse that blew up the sisters' respectability for good, printing a sensational exposé of the most famous preacher in America, Henry Ward Beecher, a man on a salary of $100,000 a year, accusing him of an affair with a married parishioner. The issue sold 100,000 copies, and reprints changed hands for $40 apiece, and it made the sisters powerful enemies. They were arrested for sending obscene matter through the mail, hauled in by the great vice crusader of the day, and they spent election night of 1872 in a cell in Ludlow Street Jail. The brokerage did not survive the panic of 1873. The weekly folded soon after, and the fortune that had lifted them, the Commodore's fortune, had already been pulled away because by about 1871, his new young wife had insisted that the little sparrow be put out of his life for good. Then the old man died on the 4th of January 1877, and left behind him a fortune of some $100 million and a family at war over it. One son, cut nearly out, contested the will, and part of his case was that his father had been of unsound mind, in thrall to spiritualists and mediums. In that fight, the Claflin sisters were exactly the wrong witnesses to have loose in New York, women who could testify from the inside about seances and magnetic hands and an old man's ghostly terrors. They were named, again and again, as star witnesses for the contest. And then, quite suddenly, they left the country for England, and the trial went on without them. Now, honesty demands the hedge here, because the record gives us the fact and only rumours the cause. What is documented is that they were expected witnesses and did not testify, having sailed away. What was widely rumoured and never proven is that the winning side of the family, the son who took the fortune, quietly paid to put them beyond the reach of an American court. No cancelled cheque exists, but the shape of it is unmistakable. The women who knew too much about the richest man in America were, one way or another, removed from the country before they could speak. And here the pattern breaks, which is why Tennie is the strange one in this company, the exception who proves how narrow the escape was. She was erased from the Vanderbilt story, yes, pushed out of his life and then out of the nation. But she was not destroyed. She landed in England and did the most audacious thing of her whole audacious life. She married a fortune. In 1885, in a church in Kensington, she married Francis Cook, a merchant prince and holder of a Portuguese title. And Queen Victoria soon made him a baronet, so that the barefoot medium from Homer, Ohio, became Lady Cook, a viscountess with palaces in England and Portugal. And how did she land him? By the very trade her father had taught her in the medicine shows. She reportedly told the widowed Cook that she had received a message from his departed wife, urging him to marry her. The same magic that had opened the door of the richest man in America opened the door of an English baronet. The dead had always been Tennie's most reliable business partners, and they closed one last deal for her. The will fight itself was a séance dragged into a courtroom, and it shows exactly why the sisters were too dangerous to leave in the country. To break the will, the disinherited son argued that his father had been of unsound mind, a prisoner of mediums, and the trial filled with sworn testimony about the old man's traffic with spirits. One medium testified that she had carried messages to Vanderbilt from his dead first wife, whose spirit was said to be in great distress, and that the Commodore had answered he would have to make a new will to set things right with her. Another gave the courtroom a scene that could have come from a stage play, an allegation that the favoured son had leaned on a medium and said, of his own father, that he wanted the old man influenced so that he could be controlled, and that in a staged séance, the voice of the dead wife was made to say that only one son loved him, and that the old man had answered, "I will do as you wish," and the boy called William should have it all. That testimony came from hostile and doubtful witnesses, and it was fought hard, and it is best held at arm's length. But hold it up to the light, and you see why the Claflin sisters, who knew this world from the inside and could speak its language on the stand, were witnesses that the winning side of the family very much did not want in a New York courtroom. Whatever moved them, they moved across an ocean, and the trial went on without the two women who understood the séances best. The reinvention that followed was the most complete escape of any woman in this film, and it deserves its due. In England, she married her merchant prince and became, by the Queen's own hand, a titled lady, and she took to the part with all the energy she had once spent on Wall Street. She kept great houses in England and Portugal, threw famous parties, gave money to schools and charities, and went back, in her 60s, to the fight for women's votes that she had championed as a young radical in New York, so that the medicine showgirl ended her days a viscountess arguing for the female franchise in the drawing rooms of London. She outlived her husband, and his fortune came to her, and she died in England in the early 1920s, and the New York papers that had once called her a bewitching broker now noted, in a small obituary, that Lady Cook had died, the former Tennie Claflin, a spiritualist and suffragist who had made a stir in the city half a century before. Half a century, and a small obituary. Even her escape ended in a footnote. So of all 5 women, Tennie alone climbed back out. She kept none of the Vanderbilt fortune and none of the Vanderbilt story, but she took a title and a second fortune and a long, comfortable life, dying in England in 1923, near 80 years old, remembered, when she is remembered at all, in the long shadow of her more famous sister. She escaped by leaving on her own terms and marrying up one more time. The next woman we meet had a house even grander than a viscountess's, and a lover richer in some seasons than a duke, and she left the country too. But she did not leave with a title. She left after everything she owned had been carried out of her own front door, catalogued, and sold to strangers in a sale room. Chapter 10. The Girl in the House of Mystery. 2 blocks from his own Fifth Avenue palace, a traction magnate built a young woman a mansion the newspapers could only call the House of Mystery. The magnate was Charles Tyson Yerkes, and to grasp the strangeness of that house, you first have to grasp the man who paid for it, because he was one of the great buccaneers of the age. Yerkes had begun in Philadelphia, where a financial panic caught him short of the city's money and sent him to prison for embezzlement. He came out unbroken, went west, and seized control of the street railways of Chicago, wiring the city together with his cars and building its famous downtown loop by methods so bare in their bribery that the city eventually rose against him. He carried his fortune, said to be some $15 million in cash, east to New York, and then across the ocean to London, where he financed great stretches of the London Underground, the deep tube lines that still run under that city today. He was a builder of the modern world and a plunderer of it in equal measure. And somewhere in the middle of all that building he met a girl of 16. Her name was Emilie Grigsby, and her origins were their own kind of mystery, arranged partly by fate and partly by her own hand. She was born in Kentucky in the late 1870s, into a family that had once been distinguished, her mother's line reaching back to a governor of the state. But her father died young and left the family poor, and her widowed mother, needing money to keep her children in good Catholic schools, opened, by the sober account of more than one reputable source, a high-class brothel in Cincinnati. This is the fact under the whole glittering later life, and it was handled by Emilie exactly as Arabella handled Richmond, as a thing to be buried. The convent that educated her is said to have told the girl of her mother's trade and called it, cruelly, her cross to bear, and the girl seems to have decided then and there that the only escape from her mother's fate was money and rank, and that she would get both. She grew into a woman of extraordinary poise, carried herself, people said, like an empress, and let the world call her the American princess. She traveled Europe in hired private railroad cars, collected books and paintings, and the manner of an aristocrat, and built, out of the raw material of a Cincinnati scandal, a persona so polished that strangers took her for foreign royalty. And it was all calculation, every gliding inch of it, the deliberate work of a girl who had decided that the only armor against her mother's fate was to become so grand, so cultivated, so obviously above the common run, that no one would dare ask where the money came from. It was a brilliant strategy, and it carried one fatal flaw, the same flaw that undid every woman in this film. The armor could be pierced by a single well-placed question, and in society there is always someone willing to ask it. Yerkes gave her a stage worthy of the part. 2 short blocks from his own great house on Fifth Avenue, he built her a mansion on Park Avenue, a tall, narrow palace of white granite, and the papers, unable to say plainly what she was to him, took to calling it the House of Mystery. Inside it was a fever dream of money. A famous artist painted panels for its ceilings and walls. An entire floor was given over to a music room that held a piano covered completely in gold leaf. One guest bedroom was hung with 15 needlework tapestries, each said to have cost $15,000. There were themed rooms in the French and the Napoleonic taste, jade and Chinese porcelain, a miniature of Henry VIII, and there was a library, its valuable books shelved behind carved doors, holding, by one account, a first folio of Shakespeare, the most precious book in the English language, in the private library of a woman's society would not receive. The New York papers, sent to Gawk, summed the whole thing up in one dry line. Everything, they wrote, was expensive, and the general effect showed a florid taste that had been catered to with a lavish hand. Over one of the staircases hung a life-sized portrait of Emilie herself, so that a visitor climbing through the treasure house was watched down from the wall by the mistress of it all, young and painted and serene, presiding over her own museum. And that was the calculation, and for a while it worked. The very secrecy of the arrangement, the refusal to say plainly who she was or where the money came from, became a kind of glamour, and the nickname the papers gave the House of Mystery, was exactly the effect she wanted. A woman too grand and too enigmatic to be questioned. The trouble with building your life on a mystery is that a mystery is an invitation, and a whole city of bored, sharp-eyed people took it up and set about solving her. For a season, she was the most intriguing woman in New York. Then the intrigue turned to investigation, and the investigation found Cincinnati, and the same mystery that had been her armor became the thing that everyone suddenly knew, and the doors that had opened to a fascinating enigma closed hard against a plain and unwelcome fact. For a while, she reached for the thing the house was built to buy, a place in society, and for a while it seemed she might get it. She took a box at the opera. The gossip sheets noted, with the little curl of contempt they kept for such cases, that Miss Grigsby appeared to be the holder of the family funds, and that the funds were large. She brought her mother up from Cincinnati to New York, meaning to lift her out of the old life and into the new one. And that was the mistake that closed every door. Because when society's hostesses learned who the mother was and how the money had truly been made, the doors of Fifth Avenue swung shut, one after another, and stayed shut. Emilie Grigsby was left where the mistress always ended, on the wrong side of the gate, extremely rich, exquisitely cultivated, and shunned. She had built a palace to get in. The palace only made her a more conspicuous exile. There was a wife in all this, of course, and her story rhymes with Emilie's in a way that is worth holding on to, because it shows that the machine ground the wives as well as the mistresses. Mary Yerkes, called Molly, had married Charles when they were both young and had stood by him through the worst of it, visiting him so faithfully during his Philadelphia imprisonment that the jailers called her his prison angel. Her reward for the loyalty was to watch a girl of 16 installed 2 blocks up the avenue, and to bar her own doors against the younger woman the moment she understood, and to live out a marriage that had become a public arrangement with private ice at its heart. And Mary, in time, took her own revenge on the arrangement, taking up with a charming young fortune hunter, so that by the end the old man was pressing her for a divorce and threatening her place in his will. Less than a month after Yerkes died, she married that young man, and within a year she had divorced him too, and she summed up the whole glittering wreck of her life in a single line that could serve as an epigraph for every woman in this film. "Just another idol shattered," she said. "That is what all this money has done for me." Yerkes himself was a builder to the last, and it complicates the picture, because the same man who kept a teenage mistress in a mystery house also gave the world real and lasting things. He put a small fortune into an observatory for a great university, and it still bears his name and still turns its telescope on the sky. He wired Chicago, and then he wired London, and the deep tube trains that carry millions under that city every day run in tunnels he financed and lit from a power station that was, for a moment, the largest in Europe. He was a plunderer who left monuments, a swindler who built infrastructure that outlived every scandal, and it is one more turn of the film's central screw that the man's works endure, named and celebrated, while the woman who shared his rise vanished so completely that she does not even have a proper entry in the record today. The tube remembers Yerkes. Almost nothing remembers Emilie, and the whole of it, the granite and the gold piano and the folio behind its carved doors, rested on one life, the life of an ailing old buccaneer in a hotel across town. While Charles Yerkes lived, Emilie Grigsby was the queen of the House of Mystery. What she was the day after he died depended entirely on a document she had never been allowed to see. Chapter 11. Everything she owned, sold to strangers. When Yerkes died at the Waldorf in 1905, his young mistress was not named in a single line of the will. He went on the 29th of December, in the Great Hotel, 68 years old, his body worn out and his affairs in ruins. And the ruin was the first surprise. In life, he had been reckoned worth as much as $25 million, and the papers ran those grand figures over his coffin. But the London tube lines had swallowed his fortune and left it drowning in debt. And when the accounts were finally settled, most of the great estate had to be sold just to pay what he owed. The magnate who had wired 2 cities for light and motion died something close to broke. And in the will that carved up what remained, among the wife and the children and the creditors, there was not one word for Emilie Grigsby. The woman of the House of Mystery had been left exactly nothing. She had nursed him at the end, welcomed to his bedside while the estranged wife was kept away, and then she watched the world she had built come apart in public. There was a romantic story, the kind that clings to such women, that Yerkes had drawn up a second will leaving her everything and died before he could sign it, and another that he had left her a great cheque dated too far ahead to be worth anything. Both are rumour, and both should be left as rumour. The hard fact is the one that matters. She was rich one winter, and by the reckoning of the estate, cut off the next, holding a palace she could no longer keep and a collection she would have to sell. Before she went under, she tried one last strange bid to hold her place, and it destroyed what was left of her name. In 1911, the New York papers filled with cables describing Emilie Grigsby's dazzling conquest of London society, her intimacy with royalty, a claim that she and a princess of the royal house were on such terms that they called each other by their first names. It was a fairy tale, and it was a fairy tale she had written herself and planted in the press. The palace saw to it that the story was denied, and a London paper delivered the killing line that Miss Grigsby's social successes proved, on investigation, to be a baseless fabric of the imagination. She had tried to author her own legend and been exposed as the author. There was nothing to do after that but sell up and leave. So in the winter of 1912, they emptied the House of Mystery and sold it to strangers. An auction house spent 2 months cataloguing her life, and then, over several days, sold it off piece by piece. The silver and the jade and the Chinese porcelains, the tapestries, and the famous piano covered in gold. A set of jade cups and a tray fetched $6,700. Canvases by Monet and by Pissarro went under the hammer. Everything that had made her the American princess was carried out of the granite house and knocked down to the highest bidder. And there was a bitter little theatre to it, because the same thing had already happened to Yerkes's own greater collection a couple of years before, when his art went under the hammer to pay his debts, and the very society women who had refused for years to receive the pair of them, who had shut their doors and cut them on the avenue, turned up in the sale room to bid, happy enough to own the pictures once the awkward living people attached to them had been reduced to a catalogue. That is the final humiliation of the kept woman's world laid bare in an auction house. Society would not sit at dinner with her, but it would gladly buy her furniture. It would not say her name at a ball, but it would raise a gloved hand to take her jade and her canvases home. The people were unacceptable. The objects were charming. And once the objects were sold, the people could be forgotten entirely, which was, all along, the arrangement everyone preferred. There is one detail from that sale that holds the whole woman in a single image. She let almost everything go: the jade, the gold, the books behind the carved doors. But there were 2 portraits she would not sell and kept back from the auction. One was a picture of a pope. The other was a life-sized portrait of herself. Out of the emptied House of Mystery, she carried only her own beautiful face and an image of the church, the 2 halves of the convent girl the nuns had told to bear her cross, vanity and absolution, walking out the door together while strangers bid on everything else. Then she left for England and vanished about as completely as a rich woman can. She lived on for another half-century in London, an Edwardian hostess on the edges of famous lives, and when she died there in 1964, unmarried and long forgotten, her passing went almost unnoticed in the city she had once tried to conquer. What survives of her is almost too neat a symbol. Much of her wardrobe and a great travelling trunk ended up in a London museum, and the trunk is papered over with the labels of the ships she had crossed on: the Lusitania that the war would sink, the Olympic that was sister to the Titanic, the liner on which she had shared a crossing with a young writer named Scott Fitzgerald and his wife, a woman remembered for disappearing, preserved at last as a piece of luggage, stamped with the names of the century's most famous doomed ships. She had spent her life gathering beautiful objects to keep from becoming one. The objects outlived her. She became the object. There is one glimpse of her own voice in all this, and it is perfect because it is about exactly this: the beautiful things and the price of them. Asked once about her habit of cutting up priceless antique tapestries to cover her dining chairs, an act that made the connoisseurs wince, she answered with a shrug that tells you everything about how she saw the world. "But I couldn't have had my chairs," she said, "if I had not cut the tapestries." That was Emilie Grigsby, entire. Everything beautiful was there to be used, cut down, made to serve the life she was building. And if a masterpiece had to be sacrificed to upholster the seat she meant to sit in, so be it. She spent her whole life cutting up tapestries to make her chairs, and in the end, the auctioneers cut up her life the same way and sold the pieces to cover someone else's. She did not vanish quietly either, whatever the record pretends. And the truth of her later years is stranger and better than the spy stories that grew up around her. She crossed to England and, in the years of the Great War, made herself a fixture at the very apex of the British war machine. Not as any kind of spy. The evidence for that is nothing but rumour, but as something the age had no clean word for, a confidant and mistress to powerful men at the top of the army and the press. She was close to the general who ran the army's supply, close to the most influential war correspondent in the country, cultivated the greatest newspaper baron of the day, and lent her country house to field marshals for their private dinners, and she called herself, only half joking, the mascot of the High Command. A young poet is said to have spent his last night in England under her roof before he sailed off to the war that killed him, and she had his lines cast in bronze over her door. The girl from the Cincinnati boarding house had ended up whispering with the men who moved armies, and still, when she died in London in the 1960s, unmarried and past 80, the city she had tried so hard to conquer barely noticed she was gone. Emily lost the money and the world, and finally the name, all three together, and it is hard to imagine a more complete erasure. But there is one further step down, and the last woman took it. She was kept, like Emily, in secret splendour, behind a literal hidden passage. And her story did not end in a quiet sale room. It ended with a rich man shot dead on a hotel staircase, and a murder trial, and a woman 2 men had ruined each other over, left to be hooted through the streets. Chapter 12. A secret passage and a hidden fortune in emeralds. Behind the back door of the most flamboyant robber baron in New York, a covered passage was said to lead straight to the back door of the woman he could never be seen with. The baron was Jim Fisk, called Jubilee Jim, and there was no one else quite like him in the whole gaudy pageant of the age. He had come up from nothing, a peddler and a circus hand, and clawed his way onto Wall Street, where with Jay Gould and old Daniel Drew, he fought Cornelius Vanderbilt himself for control of the Erie Railroad in a war of watered stock, and bought judges and bribed lawmakers. In the autumn of 1869, he and Gould tried to corner the entire gold market of the United States and touched off the panic that history calls Black Friday, ruining men across the country in a single day. He wore velvet and diamonds and a waxed moustache, invented himself an admiral's uniform for the steamships he owned, kept brass bands to play him in and out of rooms, and gave to the poor with one hand while he swindled the nation with the other. And the woman he loved, the one fixed star in all that noise, was Josie Mansfield, whom the town called Josie. By the time Fisk found her, around 1867, she was poor and beautiful in the full, ripe way the age admired, and entirely out of better options. Fisk rescued her the way he did everything, enormously. He set her up in a brownstone on West 23rd Street, only a few doors from the Grand Opera House out of which he ran his railroad empire. And here is the detail that tells you the whole truth of the arrangement, better than any document could. He built, by the accounts of the day, a covered private passage from the back of his own domain to the back of her house, so that he could pass between his empire and his mistress without ever being seen on the street. The most conspicuous man in New York, who did everything in public with a brass band, kept this one thing hidden behind a wall. To picture where she lived is to understand the whole cruelty of her position. Fisk did not run his railroad from a bank. He ran it from the Grand Opera House, a palace of entertainment that he had bought and turned into the throne room of his empire, so that the offices of a great railroad shared a roof with a stage and a gilded auditorium and all the noise and light of the theatre. It was the most public building a man could choose, a place designed for crowds to look at spectacle. And Fisk lived at the centre of it like a prince, guarded, attended, always performing. And Josie was installed just behind it, a few doors down, connected to all that light by a passage no one could see, close enough to hear the applause and forbidden to be seen in the seats. She lived at the back of his theatre, in every sense. The whole city could buy a ticket to Jim Fisk. Only Josie was kept in the wings, paid for lavishly and shown to no one, the star of a play that was never allowed an audience. That was the shape of the gift, and the shape of the trap. Everything he gave her, and by the accounts of the day he gave her a very great deal, arrived on the condition that it stay hidden, that she stay hidden, that the most beautiful kept woman in New York be a rumor rather than a fact. A lesser woman might have accepted the terms forever. Josie had a hard eye and a long memory and a growing sense of what she was owed, and when a younger, freer, more presentable man appeared who was willing to be seen with her in the daylight, the whole careful, hidden arrangement began, very quietly, to come apart. What he gave her, by the accounts of the period press, was a fortune almost beyond counting, though those figures come to us from the newspapers rather than any ledger and should be worn a little loosely. There was the house, lavishly improved. There was cash. There were, it was said, $250,000 in Tiffany emeralds, a diamond necklace, a tiara, ropes of pearls, 25 rings, $30,000 spent in a single year to keep her adorned. Behind her back, the town gave her a name that captured both the splendor and the sneer. They called her the Cleopatra of 23rd Street. And yet, for all of it, Fisk honored the one rule the age never bent. He kept her away from the places that mattered, away from Delmonico's, away from his own box at his own opera house. He would spend a fortune on her and would not be seen at dinner with her. She had everything a mistress could be given, and none of the one thing she truly wanted, which was to be walked into a room on his arm as though she were real. She had come a long and hard way to that brownstone, and the road explains the woman. She had been born in Boston in 1847, and her father had been murdered in a far western town when she was a small child, struck down in the street by a business rival, so that violence over money stood at the very start of her story, as it would stand at the end of it. She was descended, for what it was worth, from old New England stock, from the first families off the early ships, a pedigree that did her no good at all on the hard road she actually walked. She married young, at 16, to an actor, and the marriage failed, and she drifted westward, and then east again, to New York, poor and beautiful and out of options, until she was taken up by a woman named Annie Wood, whose house was the kind of house a respectable account does not name plainly. It was there, in that house, that Jim Fisk first saw her. So the great romance that would end in gunfire began where so many of these stories begin, in the one economy that was always open to a portionless, beautiful woman, and Fisk lifted her out of it into emeralds and a brownstone, and everyone, including Josie, understood the terms. And Fisk, for all his noise, understood the terms too, and could be sharp about them. Early in the affair, Josie made the mistake of coming to his office on some personal errand, and he wrote her a cold little note about it afterward, telling her it was strange she should make his office, of all places, the scene for a personal matter, and warning her that harm could come to him from such foolishness. It is a small thing, that note, but it tells you the shape of the whole arrangement. She could have the house and the jewels and the covered passage. What she could not have was to be treated, in the daylight, in the places where his real life happened, as though she were a part of it. She was the secret at the back of the building, reached through a hidden door, and she was to stay there. A woman can live a long time on emeralds and still be starved of the one thing she is forbidden, which is to be acknowledged, and that starvation is the quiet engine under everything that happened next. Into that gilded, hidden, slightly poisoned arrangement came a third person, and Fisk himself, with the terrible innocence of a confident man, brought him in. At an open house Josie held on New Year's Day of 1870, Fisk introduced her to a handsome younger associate of his, a well-born gambler named Edward Stokes, called Ned. The two men were partners in an oil refinery and would soon be enemies over it. The man and the woman fell in love, and Jim Fisk, who could read a stock market to the penny, could not read the room in his own mistress's parlour. When the trouble finally surfaced, and Josie suggested that surely the three of them could simply go on as friends, Fisk gave her the answer that would read within 2 years, like a prophecy. "You cannot run 2 engines," he told her, "on one track, in contrary directions, at the same time." He was right, and he did not yet know how right, or that he was one of the 2 engines, or which one would be left standing on the track. Chapter 13. 2 Men and 1 Track. "You cannot run 2 engines on one track in contrary directions," Fisk told her, and within 2 years, one of them was dead. Josie had left Fisk for Ned Stokes, and the leaving turned quickly into a war over money, because Josie believed Fisk held some $25,000 that was owed to her, and Fisk would not pay it. So she reached for the one weapon a kept woman kept in reserve: the private letters, the ardent, foolish, revealing letters the great man had written her in the heat of the affair. She threatened to publish them. Unable to press the threat alone, she handed them over to Stokes, about 75 of them, and the 2 lovers used the old man's own words to try to squeeze him. Fisk struck back with the machinery of the law, and for a year, the 3 of them tore at one another through the courts. A libel suit here, a blackmail charge there, injunctions, affidavits, a public brawl between a robber baron, his former mistress, and the man who had taken her. It got uglier by the month. Fisk produced a servant to swear an affidavit that the lovers had plotted to extort him. Josie sued Fisk for libel over the accusation. Fisk had Stokes arrested for stealing from the oil refinery the 2 men had once run together, and seized the refinery outright, and went to the courts for injunctions, calling the whole business blackmail. Stokes answered threat with threat, letting it be known that he too had incriminating letters and would publish them unless he was paid. It was a war of rich men's weapons, lawyers and affidavits and the newspapers, with a woman in the middle of it, and it built and built through the winter toward the only kind of ending such a pressure ever finds. On the very day the grand jury handed up its blackmail charge against Stokes, the paper war finally broke through into the real one, and a pen was set down and a pistol was taken up. It came to its end on the 6th of January, 1872. That afternoon, Stokes learned that a grand jury had handed up a charge against him for blackmailing Fisk, and something in him gave way. He went to the Grand Central Hotel, a great pile of a building, and he waited on the staircase. Picture it, if you will, because this is the hinge on which the whole story turns. The wide hotel stair, the gaslight, a man standing at the top with a pistol in his coat and a year of humiliation behind his eyes. And below, coming in from the winter street, unsuspecting, the most flamboyant man in New York, the Baron in his fine coat, mounting the stairs of a hotel he had walked into 1,000 times. Stokes drew and fired twice. One ball tore into Fisk's belly, the other into his arm. Jubilee Jim went down on the staircase, and they carried him up to a room, and through the long night he lingered, and before he died, he named the man who had shot him. On the morning of the 7th of January, 1872, Jim Fisk was dead, and the whole city convulsed, because the people had loved their gaudy rogue, and now a jealous gentleman had shot him over a woman. The night that followed was long and public and strange. They carried the wounded Baron up into a room of the hotel, and the doctors came, and it was clear before long that the belly wound would kill him, and so, in the careful way of the age, they took his dying declaration, his own account, given while he still could give it, of who had shot him and why. He named Stokes. Stokes was seized in the hotel almost at once, the pistol scarcely cold, and there was no mystery to solve, no manhunt, only a rich man in custody and another rich man dying upstairs, and a city that stayed awake through the small hours waiting for the news it already knew was coming. When it came, on the morning of the 7th, the effect was seismic, because the man who had died was not some obscure speculator, but the most visible, most gaudy, most improbably beloved rogue in America. And he had been shot down over a woman in a hotel, like the last act of a melodrama, except that the blood was real, and the woman was real, and would have to go on living in the wreckage of it. And the city grieved for him the way it had never been allowed to grieve for a swindler, because the people had loved their rogue in spite of everything, or perhaps because of it. He had been generous in the loud public way that the poor remember, once sending a whole relief train of aid to a burning city, and he had given them a show every day of his life, and now the show was over, and they came in their thousands to see it end. They laid him out in state in the great opera house that had been the seat of his empire, and something like 20,000 people filed past the coffin, and 100,000 more filled the streets outside. And when the funeral train carried him home to Vermont, the crowds met it along the way. A robber baron, who had helped wreck the nation's gold market and bribe its legislature, was mourned like a fallen prince, and the woman at the center of the whole catastrophe was left entirely out of the pageant, uninvited to the grief as she had been uninvited to the opera box, watching from the wrong side of the wall while the city wept for the man who had kept her hidden. And then came the cruelest turn of the knife, the one that tells you what those letters, the supposed weapon, had ever really been. Within a week of the murder, the newspapers got hold of the letters and printed them, dozens of them, spread across the pages for the whole country to read. Everyone expected scandal, proof of the great man's crimes, the secret rottenness of the eerie ring. What the letters contained was none of that. They held no business secret and no confession of fraud. They held only a middle-aged man's love for a woman and his jealousy of the younger man who had taken her. The dynamite that Josie and Stokes had used to blackmail a titan, the papers that had helped get a man killed, turned out on inspection to be nothing but love letters. The most dangerous documents in New York were harmless, and the harmlessness was its own final humiliation, because it meant the whole catastrophe had been built on a handful of tender, foolish notes from a man who had simply, ruinously, loved her. We know how the terror of that year felt to Josie, because she testified to it under oath, and her testimony is the closest we come to her living voice. She told the court of the last confrontation, of Fisk with a pistol in his hand. It was a handsome pistol, she said, silver-mounted, with a pearl handle, and she had taken it up and looked at it. And she gave the court the line that turns the whole triangle from farce into tragedy, the thing Fisk had said to her at the end. He said, she testified, that unless she returned to him, he should kill Mr. Stokes. She had stood between two men, each of whom had told her in his own way that he would rather destroy the other than lose her, And in the end, one of them made good on it, on a staircase in the gaslight, and she was left holding nothing but the blame. And she had not gone quietly into that blame either. In the thick of the feud, before the shots, she had fought Fisk in the one arena open to her, the newspapers, publishing an open letter that gave back every ounce of his contempt. He had told her once, she wrote, that it was to be either a Fisk palace in New York or a stone palace at Sing Sing, and that if it came to the prison, he trusted she would take a cottage outside its walls to be near him. He had secured his palace, she wrote, and now he used the whole force of his Erie officials to slander and injure her. It is a remarkable document, a kept woman answering a titan in his own key, and it tells you she was never the passive ornament the later story made her, but a sharp and formidable adversary who understood exactly how the war of words was fought. That is part of why the city could not forgive her. She had refused to be pitiable. She had fought back in public, on the page, as an equal, and a woman who fights a great man as an equal and loses is punished twice, once for losing and once for having dared. Because the blame, once the shots were fired, fell almost entirely on her. The man had pulled the trigger. The woman, the newspapers decided, had loaded the gun by being what she was. And what the courts and the crowds did to Josie Mansfield in the years after the murder is the last, and in some ways the ugliest, erasure in this whole film. Chapter 14. The city that hooted her in the street. The rich man who killed him got a carpeted cell and 4 years, and the woman got the blame. Ned Stokes was tried not once but 3 times. So long and so hard did his money fight for him. The first trial ended with a jury unable to agree after 22 days. The second convicted him of murder and sentenced him to hang. The death sentence pronounced, by a grim coincidence, exactly 1 year to the day after he had fired the shots. Then the higher court threw the conviction out on a point of law and ordered yet another trial, and the third jury, worn down, brought it in as manslaughter, and Stokes was sentenced to 4 years and served only about 3. And while he waited in the tombs for justice to be brought down to size, he did not wait as other prisoners waited. His cell was carpeted and papered and hung with pictures, more like a young lady's sitting room than a prison. His meals sent in from Delmonico's, the very restaurant Josie had never been allowed to enter on Fisk's arm. A critic of the day said the plain truth of it. Had Stokes been an unlettered labourer, he would have hanged within 2 months. He was rich, and so he lived. Look at the arc of those 3 trials, because it is a short course in what money could buy a man in that country and what it could not buy a woman. The first jury could not agree, after more than 3 weeks of argument. The second found him guilty of murder and set a date for him to hang, and for a moment it looked as though even a rich man might swing. Then the higher court found a flaw in the way the jury had been instructed, threw the whole conviction out, and ordered the thing tried again from the start. And the third jury, ground down by the endless expensive proceedings, brought it in at last as a lesser killing. And the man who had fired 2 balls into the most famous financier in America walked out of prison in about the time it takes to grow bored of a scandal. Money did that. Money paid the lawyers who found the flaw. Money furnished the carpeted cell. Money turned a hanging into a few years and a few years into freedom. And the same money that softened every edge for the man who pulled the trigger did nothing at all for the woman the crowds had decided to blame, because she did not have it. And because the one thing the age would never forgive was a woman who had traded on her beauty, and then had the bad taste to survive the men who paid for it. Josie was not rich, not really. Not once the protector was in his grave, and she had no such shield. She went to law to claim what she believed Fisk owed her, suing his widow for $200,000, and she lost. And as she fought, The public turned on her with a venom that is hard to read even now. Crowds followed her and hooted her in the street. When she appeared at Saratoga, the fashionable resort, the first-class hotels refused her a room, and respectable women rose and walked out of a courtroom rather than sit while she took a seat. She had been the Cleopatra of 23rd Street, kept in emeralds behind a secret passage. Now she was a thing to be jeered at on a public pavement, a cautionary figure. The woman two men had destroyed each other over, and the world had decided the destruction was her fault and hers alone. What followed was a slow vanishing that ran on for decades. She left for Paris. She surfaced now and then in the papers, always in some sad new key, married and divorced, reported poor, reported ill, reported living under other names. Once, more than 40 years before she actually died, a newspaper announced her death and described her burial, and it was simply false. She was alive across the ocean, already so nearly forgotten that the press could kill her off by mistake, and hardly anyone noticed. She had become a rumour of herself, a name that surfaced only to be pitied or mocked, drifting through the back pages of a country that had once hung on her every move. She died at last in Paris, in 1931, in an American hospital there, an old woman of 83, of a cancer of the stomach. Under a married name, almost no one connected any longer to the famous beauty of 1872. And the single image that closes her story is the one the newspaper itself gave her, in the headline over the notice of her funeral. "Only 3 mourners," it read, "at Josie Mansfield's grave. 3 people. 2 of them servants." That was the whole company at the burial of the woman a Wall Street king had been shot dead over, the woman whose face had filled the papers and stopped traffic, the woman 2 men had ruined each other and themselves for. She was put into the ground in a Paris cemetery beside her mother, with 3 mourners, and the country that had hooted her did not send even one. The long middle of that exile is a study in how thoroughly a famous woman could be unmade. She sailed for Paris only a year after the murder, and the very manner of her going was a scandal, for she went in the company of a woman who performed on the stage as a man, and the papers at home clucked over it for weeks. She kept a kind of salon there for a time, on the edges of the American colony in Paris. Years later, she married again, an expatriate American lawyer in London, and that marriage too came apart, the husband declining into drink and worse. And through all of it, the newspapers could not decide whether she was rich or ruined, and printed both, often falsely, chasing rumours of the fallen beauty of 1872 living in poverty under one assumed name or another. She had become a story the press told itself, detached almost entirely from the actual aging woman crossing and recrossing the ocean, so unmoored from the facts that once, decades early, they buried her by mistake and described the funeral of a woman who was sitting alive in Paris. To be reported dead while living is its own peculiar erasure, the record closing over a woman who has not yet even left. When the real end came, it was quiet and unattended and far from home, and the newspaper that recorded it could not resist the arithmetic of her fall. She was buried beside her own mother, the 2 of them together at last in the foreign ground, mother and daughter, the beginning and the end of a life that had blazed across the front pages of a continent. And over that grave stood the 3 mourners, and no one else, for the woman a nation had once been unable to stop talking about. And what of the man who fired the shots, the one whose money bought him out of the noose? Ned Stokes served his few years and came out and lived on for decades, ran a hotel, moved through the city as a known figure, a man who had killed the most famous financier in America and paid almost nothing for it. But the record leaves one detail that reads like a judgment, even so. In his last years, by the account of his own obituary, he was a haunted man, fearful and suspicious and sick, forever glancing over his shoulder, as though the thing he had done on that staircase had followed him out of the prison he barely served and taken up residence in him for good. He kept his freedom and lost his peace. Josie kept neither. Between the two of them, they had destroyed Jim Fisk and themselves, and the money that had shielded the man could not, in the end, buy him a quiet night. And the beauty that had lifted the woman could not buy her a single mourner she had not once paid to keep house for her. There is an eerie footnote, and it belongs to Fisk, not to her, and yet it seems to be about her all the same. Over his grave far away in Vermont, his admirers had raised a great marble monument, and around his portrait they set 4 half-draped female figures meant to stand for his empire, his railroads and steamships, and the stage and finance. A friend of his, looking at them, made a black little joke that Fisk had trouble with women all his life, so they had put 4 of them over his grave to haunt him through eternity. In the years since, the marble has blackened and the souvenir hunters have chipped it away, and at last the very portrait of Fisk was taken from the stone, leaving only a faint shadow in the empty oval where his face had been. Even the monument to the man erased him in the end, and Josie, who outlived him by 60 years, got her own strange scrap of immortality. Her face, from an old photograph, was engraved on a United States banknote of high value, a $1,000 note the collectors came to call the courtesan note. The woman the country buried with 3 mourners had been, all along, hidden in its own money. From the woman who erased herself to keep her fortune, to the woman the city erased with its own bared teeth, the pattern is complete now, and it is time to stand back and count the cost, and to ask the question the whole evening has been circling. Whose hands were really on all of it, and why do we remember the men? Chapter 15. The buildings kept their names, and the women lost theirs. Walk into the great museums today and the art is hers, the library is hers, the fortune was hers, and her name is on none of it. This is the strangest part of the whole reckoning, and the clearest proof that the erasure worked, because it is still working right now, in the rooms where we keep our memory. Go to San Marino in California, to one of the loveliest collections of European art in America, and you are standing inside Arabella Huntington's taste, walking through galleries she assembled with an eye no man in the story could match. Go to the Great Museum on Fifth Avenue, and you can stand before the Rembrandt she bought in a single afternoon, given by her son from her estate. The buildings carry the Huntington name, and the Huntington name in the public mind means the men. The woman whose judgment chose it all is a whisper in a footnote, exactly as she arranged. It is the same everywhere you look. Cross to London, and there is Emilie Grigsby's travelling trunk in a national museum, her gowns preserved behind glass, the woman herself dissolved into a costume display. Drive up the California coast, and there is Hearst Castle, a monument to the man, and down on the Santa Monica Sand, the surviving marble pool of the house Marion Davies ran, now a public beach club where strangers swim over the tiles of her lost Versailles. Even the money remembers what the history forgot. Josie Mansfield's face rode for years on a $1,000 note, hidden in the currency of the country that buried her with 3 mourners. The stone and the canvas and the engraving all survived. The women attached to them were quietly detached, one by one, until only the men's names were left holding the deed. And where the buildings did not finish the job, the storytellers did, because the 20th century turned out to be even better at erasing these women than the 19th had been. The Gilded Age closed the doors and cut them from the wills. The new century made them into characters and sold the characters back to the public as the truth. Theodore Dreiser took Charles Yerkes and built a great trilogy of novels around him, and folded Emilie Grigsby into it as a young mistress named Berenice, so that the real woman became a supporting figure in a man's saga. And Orson Welles took Marion Davies, the comedienne who had saved Hearst with her own $1 million, and turned her into Susan Alexander, the talentless drunk in the empty castle, and taught the whole country to remember the cartoon and forget the woman. The machine that had once been newspapers and wills and society columns became novels and films, and it ran the same errand. Take the woman out of the record. Leave the man. And it is worth seeing how differently the erasure was worked on each of them, because the variety is the proof that it was a habit and not an accident. Arabella was erased by her own hand, and the world was glad to help, letting the woman once reckoned the richest in America become a caption under the men's names on the museum walls she filled. Tennie was erased by removal, shipped across an ocean, and then quietly folded into the shadow of a more famous sister, until the healer who steadied the Commodore became a footnote to a footnote. Emily was erased by auction, and then by silence, sold off and sailed away, until even the reference books forgot to give her a page. Josie was erased by ridicule, hooted out of her own country, and buried abroad with 3 mourners. And Marion, who had the money and the fame and the whole warmth of the age, was erased by art itself, replaced in the national mind by a fiction so vivid that the truth could not compete with it. 5 methods, 1 result. However it was done, the woman came out of the frame, and the man's name stayed carved above the door. And look at what their money and their taste actually seeded, once you know to trace it back past the men's names on the doors. A great cancer hospital grew in part from a gift one of them made in grief. A pair of the finest art museums in the country hold at their heart the eye of a woman who taught herself to see. A children's hospital still treats the sick on the strength of a comedian's fortune. Wall Street opened its first door to women because a fortune-teller's daughter pushed one open with a dead man's money. These were not passive vessels through which male fortunes happened to pass. They were, every one of them, agents with judgment and appetite and nerve, and the institutions they helped raise are still standing, still working, still, in most cases, wearing somebody else's name over the entrance. The erasure did not touch what they built. It touched only the memory of who built it. Trace the objects themselves, and the point sharpens. Arabella's paintings, her Rembrandts and more, went from her estate into the great museum on Fifth Avenue and out to the Legion of Honor on the far coast, and her whole collecting eye lives on in the library and galleries at San Marino. Emily's gowns and her travelling trunk sit in a museum in London. The pool where Marion once presided is a public beach house open to anyone who walks in off the sand. Josie's face was folded into the nation's own currency. The pieces are everywhere, in the finest rooms the country keeps, and the names attached to them, when there are names at all, are almost always the men who paid, or the institutions that inherited, and almost never the women whose judgment and money and nerve put the things there in the first place. And before we comfort ourselves that this was all long ago, it is worth asking how much has really changed. How often, even now, the woman beside the powerful man is written down as decoration. Her judgment folded quietly into his legend, her name. The first thing dropped when the story is told for the 100th time. The particular machinery of coverture and the closed ballroom is gone. The instinct underneath it, to remember the man and forget the woman whose hands were also on the thing, has proved a great deal harder to bury than any statute. There is one honest question left to ask before we close, and it is the one that keeps this from being only a lament. Was any of it worth it? Each of these 5 reached, with her own hands, something that women of her age were told they could never touch. A railroad, a publishing empire, the first female firm on Wall Street, the taste behind a national collection, the whole heart of a robber baron. They paid for the reaching, and the bill was always the same: erasure, whether it came as a caricature or an auction or a grave with 3 mourners. And yet not one of them, given the choice again, seems likely to have chosen the small, safe life instead. Arabella died what the papers called the richest woman in America. Tennie died a viscountess. Marion died beloved by the people who actually knew her, her true gift now restored by the very historians the caricature once fooled. The world took their names off the record. It could never quite take the fact that their hands had been there, on the levers, on the money, on the future, all along. And once you know to look, you cannot stop seeing whose hands were on it. That is the answer for the 3 who came out ahead, or at least alive. For the 2 who did not, the accounting is harder, and it should not be softened. Emilie Grigsby spent her whole clever life reaching for a place at the table, and ended selling the table itself to strangers and vanishing into a foreign obscurity so complete that the reference books forgot her. Josie Mansfield reached for love and a settlement, and got a dead man on a staircase, a nation's contempt, and a grave with 3 mourners. There is no tidy moral that redeems those 2 endings, no consolation that makes the auction or the jeering crowd worth it. And yet, even there, the reaching was real. The power was real. The mark they left on the men and the money was real. And the only thing the world managed to take from them at the last was the memory of it, which is a smaller theft than it looks, because a memory can be recovered. The erasure never touched the fact of their power at all. It reached only for the record of it, and tried to wipe the record clean, and for 100 years it very nearly succeeded. Which returns us, at the end, to the woman we began with, and to the pool on the sand, and to the pieces of a scattered reputation that the years are only now fitting back together. Chapter 16. Whose hands were on it? The cheapest way to take a woman's power was to leave the power itself alone and erase the memory of it. Deny nothing. Fight nothing. Simply make certain that no one remembered she had held it, because a fact that no one recalls may as well never have happened. That is the lesson under all 5 lives. The age did not trouble to argue that these women were powerless. It arranged for their power to be forgotten, and let the forgetting do the work that an honest fight never could. So let us do the one thing the age was built to prevent and refuse to forget, and go back down the whole line of them one last time, and put the question to each, plainly, and answer it plainly, and give the answer the weight of a name. Because that is all the record ever really needed, a hand attached to a name. And the age spent a century keeping the 2 apart. And the forgetting was thorough. It took 100 years and a change in who tells the stories before anyone went back to the record and asked the plain question of each of them, and answered it. Whose hands were on the fortune? Arabella Huntington's hands, choosing the Rembrandt, keeping the millions in her own name, burning her own letters so that no man and no court could ever hold her past against her. Whose hands were on the empire? Marion Davies's hands, writing the check for $1 million, selling the jewels, holding upright the richest publisher in America when his own castles were sinking. Whose hands were on the money that opened Wall Street to women? Tennie Claflin's hands, the healer's hands that revived a terrified old titan and were paid in the capital that built the first female brokerage in the country. Whose hands were on the House of Mystery, the gold piano, the folio behind the carved doors. Emilie Grigsby's hands that kept back from the auction only her own portrait and an image of the church. whose hands were on the letters that got a robber baron killed. Josie Mansfield's hands that took up the silver pistol and looked at it and were left holding nothing at all. 5 women, 5 sets of hands, on the levers of the greatest fortunes the country ever made. Say the names once more, because the saying is the whole point, the one repair still available to us. Arabella Huntington, Marion Davies, Tennie Claflin, Emilie Grigsby, Josie Mansfield. Not the mistress of, not the companion of, not the woman who was seen with, but the women themselves, with their own appetites and their own judgment and their own nerve, who reached into the center of American money and power and left their mark on it and were tidied away for the trouble. The men whose names we kept could not have built what they built without these 5. The record pretended otherwise for 100 years. The record was wrong. Notice what all 5 hands have in common, because it is the thing the record worked hardest to hide. In every case, the man is remembered and the woman is not. And in every case, the woman's part was not decoration, but power, real power, the kind that moves money and shapes decisions and builds institutions that outlive everyone. The railroad baron is a name on a library. The publisher is a name on a castle. The traction king is a name on a tunnel under London. The commodore is a name that still stands for money itself. The robber baron is a name on a monument in Vermont. And standing just out of the frame of every one of those names is a woman whose hands were on the fortune, or the empire, or the taste, or the firm, or the fatal letters, and whose reward for it was to be tidied out of the picture so that the name could stand alone and uncomplicated, a great man and his works, with no awkward question about who else had been in the room. The erasure was not an accident of history. It was the final, quiet transaction of each of these lives, the last thing the age took from a woman after it had taken everything else, her place in the memory of what she had done. One of them said it out loud, once, in a courtroom, before the machinery of forgetting could reach her, and her words are the truest epitaph the whole company could have. "I have power," Tennie Claflin told the court, "and I know my power. Commodore Vanderbilt knows my power. There was no boast in it." She was testifying under oath to the single fact the age was built to bury, that a woman could stand at the center of all that money and all that force, and know exactly what she was and what she was doing, and whose hand was on the lever. They put her on a boat for saying it. They could not make it untrue. And that is the whole quarrel of this film, held in a single courtroom sentence. The age could exile the woman who said it, could sink her firm, could hand her fortune to a widow, could ship her across an ocean and let her sister eclipse her, could do all of that, and did. What it could never do was reach back into the record and make the sentence false. She had power, and she knew her power, and the richest man in America knew it too, and no amount of forgetting could turn that into a lie. It could only bury it. And a thing that is buried, unlike a thing that is disproven, can always be dug back up, which is the one small justice these 5 lives still allow us, more than a century late. And so back to Marion, on the sand, where we started. The great house is gone, torn down, and only the marble pool remains, and the bridge over it, out under the California sun. For decades, the caricature was all that was left of her, the drunk in the empty castle doing her jigsaw puzzles, and there is a bitter fitness in that image, because putting Marion Davies back together has been exactly that, a jigsaw, the slow fitting of scattered true pieces into the shape of the real woman, the wit, the shrewd investor, the loyal heart, the $1 million rescue, the comedian. The whole thing was built to hide. The last word belongs to her, and it is not bitter, because she never was. Hearst, she said, had thought he was building up a star, had seen her, in all his good faith, as an actress. She hoped, she said, that before he died, he had found out she was not one. And then the line that holds all 5 of these women in a single breath, the hope underneath the erasure, the thing none of them ever quite lost. Still, she said, still, I think he thought I was. The buildings will keep the men's names. Go and stand in them anyway, and look at what is on the walls, and ask the old question one more time, and this time answer it. Whose hands were on it? Hers. They always were. That is the whole of it, 5 women and the men who could not have risen without them. If a story like this is why you came, then subscribe and stay with me, because I spend my evenings giving these women back the hours the record stole. And tell me, in the comments, which of the 5 you had never heard of before tonight, and whether you think she was a victim of her time or the smartest person in the room. I read everyone, and I am always glad you are here.